Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. A short disclaimer, the information presented here is for the purpose of informing the board. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the views of the board or any board member. We are recording today's session. You will be able to access it on our website, ssab.gov. Questions and comments are welcomed and encouraged and can be submitted via the Zoom Q&A function or email us at events@ssab.gov. You can also tweet us using our handle @ssabgov. Feedback is also welcome and can be sent via email to events@ssab.gov. And with that, I will hand it over to our board chair, Bob Jundev.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the Social Security Advisory Board, I'm delighted to welcome you as we kick off the board's fiscal year 2022 speaker series. We have two cybersecurity experts speaking with us this afternoon. Dave Pauner is an executive director of the Center for Data-Driven Policy and the director of strategic engagement and partnerships at the MITRE Corporation. Dave will discuss the May 2021 Cybersecurity Executive Order, including cyber priorities and implications for federal agencies. He will also explore current cybersecurity initiatives at OMB and on the Hill. After a short break, our second speaker, Jim Richburg, Fortinet's Chief Information Security Officer, will brief us on public and private sector cybersecurity challenges, lessons from private sector cybersecurity advancements, and the acceleration of digital transformation brought on by COVID-19. After each presentation, we will open it up to board and staff questions here at SSAB, and that will be followed by questions from the public. Remember, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom to submit your questions at any time. Both Dave and Jim's biographies are available on our website, and a link to them will be provided in the chat message. Now, to our first speaker. Dave Pauner has more than 25 years of experience in both the public and private sectors. Before joining MITRE, Dave served as a director at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO. He led numerous reviews of federal information technology, testifying before Congress more than 100 times. He has won numerous Federal Computer Week's Federal 100 awards, and in 2017, Dave received the Eagle Award for his contributions to the federal information technology community. Thanks, Dave, for joining us this afternoon, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, Bob, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with the board today. As you mentioned, I would like to, I've been asked to update everyone on, what's going on in the world of cyber policies and federal IT policies, both up on the Hill and in the current administration. So what I'd like to do today, the goal today is to kind of highlight some of the key things that are in the works, some things that are coming down the pike so that the big ticket policy items are really on everyone's radar screen. So a couple things before we get started here. So I've been at MITRE about 3 years now. And a quick background on MITRE. So we run 6 federally funded research and development centers. So there's one on national security, one on enterprise modernization. That's where we do our SSA work. But we have these 6 FFRDCs, and we have all these innovation labs, and they're focused on cyber and acquisition, things like systems engineering. So we have about 8,000 employees, 6 FFRDCs. So we have a good picture when you look at IT and cyber activities across both the civilian and national security organizations across the federal government. So when I came to MITRE, we inform policy at times. We don't lobby, we don't sell products, but we do inform policymakers in Congress and the executive branch. And a lot of that was when they asked MITRE for their input on certain things. So what happened was when I came to MITRE, we were doing a little more of that, especially up on the Hill with my background and everything, and interactions that I have like with the Executive Office of the President. But last September, we launched what's we call the Center for Data-Driven Policy. And what we really wanted to do is to use our expertise to better inform policymakers, both in Congress and in the executive branch, because our belief is that if we have better policies, that makes for a better functioning government. So, what do? We, respond to RFIs. We comment on draft legislation. We write policy papers. We hold events. This first year, I think we issued about 30 policy-related papers and held like 25 different events covering all kinds of different topics. But one good example to kind of drive home like how we inform policy, there's a cyber security executive that was issued mid-year this year. And in that executive order, it calls for agencies to do many things from a cyber front. And I'll get into this a little bit later. But interestingly, when you look at the cyber executive order, there are 25 tasks in the executive order for the Office of Management and Budget. So what does that mean? That means that OMB has all these policy tasks in the executive order. So as an example of that, we're heavily involved with many aspects of the cyber executive order at MITRE. And because of that, our breadth and depth across the federal government, we're uniquely positioned to help inform policy. So we were asked by like the federal CISO and others to comment on some of the draft strategies that are out, and I'll get into some of those things. But that's really kind of the goal of our policy center. And so what I'll do now is, if we could put up the slides and go to the second slide, I can just start kind of clipping through kind of what's going on from an executive branch perspective and also on the Hill. We're going to break this down by cyber, IT modernization. And then I also want to talk a little bit too about customer experience. I know the report that your expert panel issued had a heavy CX focus, and it should, with the mission that SSA has. And I want to talk a little bit too about how all these things, cyber, IT modernization, the Evidence Act and the CX, the customer experience activities, how we need to kind of integrate all these so that we better improve mission delivery at agencies. So let's start with slide 2, if we could put those up. And the first thing I would like to talk about is can everyone see the slides? Because I don't know if I can.
No, I don't see them either.
Well, I will go ahead and just jump into it while the slides are coming.
Yeah, if you just get us a moment to get the slides up, I've just temporarily put the slides in the chat so people can follow along there, but it looks like we're just getting it up. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. No problem. So if we go to slide 2. And so let's start from a cyber perspective, because obviously we had a lot of activity, with some of the ransomware payments and the SolarWinds attack and the whole bit. But so in May of this year, following the SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline incidents and some other things, there was a cyber executive order. And so what did that cyber executive order do? It really called for a modernization of the federal government's cyber posture. Focus on, you probably heard these terms, high value assets. Do we really know what our high value assets are to secure them more? How do we pursue secure cloud offerings? Zero trust architecture, I'll get a little bit into that. Software supply chains is a big focus within the cyber executive order. So there's a heavy focus on how do we perform the right risk mitigation measures when we look at our software supply chains. Some of you may have heard this term software bill of materials, where some of the software providers may be asked to provide a software bill of materials. What it is, it's like an ingredients list for that software that's delivered to ensure that that software has the proper cyber hygiene associated with it. Within the cyber executive order, there was also a call for playbooks to respond to vulnerabilities and incidents. And what was interesting, those vulnerability and incident playbooks, I think, were just issued last week by the Cyber Security Infrastructure Security Agency, so known as CISA DHS. So again, you could see the cybersecurity order came out. There's been a lot of activity. There's also things in there like logging requirements, real specific logging requirements, so that we can go after cyber incidents really from the forensics perspective. So following the cyber EO, I talked a little bit about some of the OMB policies that were to come out pursuant to the cyber executive order. And a couple key things here with OMB. So if you look at zero trust, there was a call for zero trust, to have a maturity model on zero trust and cloud security. I want to talk a little bit about zero trust first here, because this is a big focus. You're going to hear a lot about this, that we're now tackling. We have the zero trust approach to cyber, and what is zero trust architectures and the whole bit. And Sunny, I don't know if we could jump to slide 4, but if we could do that, I'm going to just jump around a little bit here because I think it's really important to talk about what zero trust means. So zero trust is this notion. Prior, we always had this cyber approach that we would trust but verify. And there was a strong emphasis, what I would say, on perimeter defenses, okay? Now with zero trust, there's this notion that we never trust and we verify every user, device, and application. So it's kind of a change in mindset. And what I want to get across is when you look at zero trust and what it is, it's some things we always did, and it's not one thing, but it's a collection of processes that really helps us tackle our cybersecurity posture. So we'll start with identity. So there's some tenets here that I've listed on the slide on what zero trust is all about. So it calls for strong identity practices. And what does that mean? Strong passwords, multi-factor authentication. So that's really the big push when we identify ourselves. Passwords and multi-factor authentication is a big emphasis with zero trust. Devices, that we recognize all our devices on our networks and our endpoints. It calls for complete inventories of what is on our networks. Again, strong identity practices and having inventories of what we have really is not something new, but it's an emphasis. And then when you look at networks, what do we do with networks? Strong encryption. There's also some aspects of zero trust where you have network segmentation where you can block off certain portions of the networks. And then finally, there's applications. Do we perform the right vulnerability testing on the applications that we have? And again, there's also a big emphasis with zero trust with the migration to the cloud, that we have a safe and robust use of cloud applications. So again, when you look at zero trust, what is it? It's a collection of all these things, many of which we've been doing for a long time. And it just kind of upped our game on, identity, encryption, and some of these other items. So what's the big takeaway? And I think the big takeaway for the board here is there needs to be a very clear zero trust strategy or roadmap for each organization in the federal government. So right now, many departments and agencies are putting together what they're calling zero trust strategies or roadmaps, because most of them are at different starting points when you look at their maturity of cyber. So what you want to do is say, okay, well, where are we at on all these things on multi-factor authentication and our strong encryption and network segmentation? And where do we need to go to get there? And again, this is not, as we mature, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. As we mature our zero trust approaches, it's really kind of a multi-year approach. You're continuously maturing. But I will tell you right now that I think the big thing that needs to be put in place is just a clear picture, understanding of where the agencies are at today, and then what's that sequencing plan for how they're going to continue to mature. And I will say this, the zero trust strategy, OMB had it out for comment, and a couple big things that we commented. There were technical comments we obviously had on the zero trust guidance, but one of the things, and it's back to this roadmap, is I think some agencies, in terms of prioritization or how they sequence what they do to improve their cybersecurity posture, there might be some help organizations have with that. So we strongly suggested that help with prioritization and sequencing of these zero trust approaches is pursued. And then the other thing too is there's many non-technical things that have to be put in place when you really look at the zero trust journey. And I would say, start with, you have the budgets to tackle. So if you have this roadmap to mature where we need to go, or the budgets in place to get those things in place. And then of course, this is always a key challenge in the federal government, but you have the right workforce behind these things to ensure that we're heading in the right direction. And, and again, I think with the right workforce, there's the internal workforce, but, do we then supplement it with the right individuals in industry to make sure that we're actually progressing to where we want to go. So if we then go back to slide 2, Sunny, that would be great. And I know I'm a little out of order, but the one thing I do want to mention here is the president's management agenda. So when we look, and I was actually prepared to say, hey, we know that the president's management agenda is actively being worked, and we're curious what's going to come out with the president's management agenda that is released, which just yesterday, the administration released the president's management agenda vision. So again, it's not the full president's management agenda, but there's 3 priorities within this vision. It is workforce, customer experience. Then the 3rd priority is managing the business of government. And what is that? So the business of government ends up being, the financial management, tech, cyber, supply chain. And there's mentions of cybersecurity and IT modernization in that section on managing the business of government. What we're really on the lookout now for from the administration, we have EOs, we have OMB policies, and I'm going to get to the legislation here in a second from a cyber perspective. But really what's going to happen with the PMA and the next steps, because we have, it's great on goals and it's intentionally light on details. So what the administration is currently saying now that in early 2022, they're going to come out with these things called cross-agency priority goals. And they're going to be associated with things like cyber and IT modernization and financial management. The typical president's management, like the business of government type topics. So those goals will be coming out in early 2022. And then there will be reporting on performance.gov associated with those goals. So kind of a similar process to what previous administrations have pursued, but we're going to be on the lookout for some of those details coming out of the PMA. If we go to the next slide then, and really it's what I would say right now is if you look at the executive branch, a lot of good things trying to get our cyber house, really in order and up with current standards. If you look at Congress, I would say, there's more catch up here in Congress. And the reason I say that is there's legislation up there that's rather dated and we need to get that up to speed. It's not that Congress isn't working on it. So I'll start with, there's many what I would call skinny bills or individual bills and legislation up there on incident and ransomware reporting, where you report to DHS on your incidents and if you made a ransomware payment, and there's some legislation that talks about fines being involved with that. That gets a little complicated. I know there was a hearing last week where the Department of Justice and the FBI said, on the ransomware payments, they need to be heavily involved and get into this interagency coordination and info sharing and that type of thing. So that's been a heavy, heavy focus in Congress, incident reporting and ransomware reporting. Because many times, as we all know, everyone's reactionary to what's happening with the here and now, right? But there's other pieces of legislation up there like the FedRAMP bill. So this is, Jerry Connolly in Virginia is a big proponent of FedRAMP. FedRAMP is a GSA cloud security certification program. So you can go in early and you can be certified that you're providing secure cloud services by GSA. And what the draft legislation does, one, it codifies the FedRAMP program into law, but it also automates the certification process for cloud providers, because many cloud providers will say that it's a lengthy and costly process. And if you can quicken the pace of the certification process, then we get cloud providers and cloud solutions. There's more of those will be certified up front. Here's the big one. When you look at FISMA and the FISMA bills that are currently comprehensive FISMA reform. So what is FISMA? So FISMA is actually Federal Information Security Management Act. It was last updated in 2014. Okay, so you could see there that we're a little bit behind the times when you look at the FISMA legislation. And we're at a point now where what we want to do is there's draft bills up there where FISMA is currently being reformed. And I would say that from a FISMA point of view, a couple things to look for. We have right now with what I call those incident reporting and ransomware payment bills, which is really like after an incident occurs, there's a lot of focus on that. What FISMA really needs to do is, I would say, move to the left of incidents. And what does that mean? That actually means that we're actually looking at ways to protect and detect before we actually have some of these things happen. So things like monitoring your networks through continuous diagnostic monitoring, and some of those things are really important. The other thing that I would say, when you look at the current legislation, there's a lot of money that currently goes to reports. And there's a lot of lengthy reports that are currently called for. And again, what I would say is the reporting is fine, but we need to find a way to streamline the reporting so that our reports and also our audits are more timely, and we spend less money on the reports and audits. Not to say that they aren't important, they are, but we need to make sure that more money goes towards protecting our assets, our networks, and our systems and our data. The other thing that I will say, there's a big emphasis in the draft bill on getting the right metrics in place. This is very important. I will tell you, when I was at GAO and we put, there's actually a FATAR scorecard, and there's a cyber way that Congress scores cyber right now on the FATAR scorecard, and it's graded by these OMB metrics that are currently reported by each agency. And the metrics aren't bad, but when you go to federal chief information security officers of major departments and agencies, you find that they use a different set of metrics than what they report to OMB. So what you really want to do is we want to get a comprehensive set of metrics and not have two sets of books. Let's get a good set of metrics that if we are going to be reporting to OMB, it's similar to the metrics that agencies use to monitor their cyber operations within their agencies and departments. The other thing that I will mention on FISMA reform is I do think the notion, and we're going to get to this next, and this is a good transition to the next slide, is this notion of legacy system modernization. You know, we have a lot of legacy systems out there. SSA falls into this category. And some of those legacy systems do have security vulnerabilities given the lack of maintenance and warranties, lack of warranties on the hardware, and upgrade software they're currently provided. So again, I think there's also an effort afoot to make sure that legacy system modernization is integrated and not a separate effort with the FISMA reform. I'm encouraged by the FISMA bill. I think that Congress is working very hard, in particular, Senator Peters and Portman on the Senate side, to get some of these things up to date, more in line with what's happening on the executive branch. So if we could go to the, actually, probably slide 5 now on IT modernization, we can jump into this then. So IT modernization, let's start with legacy. So there's been a lot of activity, I would say, the last year and a half from on the Senate side with Senator Hassan, Maggie Hassan. I know in June of last year, 2020, she sent out a series of questions to about 10 agencies that did include SSA, and it asked questions about things like the IT modernization plan, what were the top 5 priorities when you look at the legacy modernization picture, and then there were more detailed questions on like the status of those plans and the like. So I find that Senator Hassan and her team in the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee has been on this topic for about a year and a half. They also held several hearings this year in 2021. One included a panel of previous federal CIOs who since have left the government. And then most recently, they had a panel with the federal CIO, the head of the Technology Transformation Service at GSA, and the head of the digital services team out of the White House discussing this legacy challenge. So a couple things here on the legacy front. We're very interested in what's going to happen next on the Hill. There's some hints at maybe legislation when you look at legacy modernization and really tackling these archaic systems we have that do pose some maintenance challenges and some security challenges to agencies. So that's on the watch list. And I'll also say too, the final bullet here on the President's management agenda in OMB, it'll be interesting to see what those cross-agency priority goals come out and how much they highlight this legacy challenge we have. I will just say from a personal perspective, this is something that I looked at when I was in the legislative branch with GAO. And now that I'm at MITRE, many of our federal agencies that we work with at MITRE have these legacy challenges. It's something that we do need to get more serious about. We tend to kick the can down the road because these are big applications tied to mission critical operations, and they pay enough, but each year our technical debt continues to rise and the security vulnerabilities get more exposed. And I really think we need to take more of a challenge, more of an approach to tackling these legacy modernization challenges. And I'm appreciative of the efforts of Senator Hassan and what her staff has done to kind of highlight this issue and push the ball forward. So if we go to the next slide, customer experience. So, and again, just a shout out to the IT expert panel report from last December that was issued for the Social Security Advisory Board. Heavy emphasis on CX. I really liked what that report had to say there. And you had some deep CX experts who worked on that. So again, most of these agencies, when you look at, you tie cyber and modernization, this all ties to a better customer experience, because I think it's difficult at times to have the customer experience or citizen experience we want from these agencies with some of the archaic systems that we have in place. We can do some nibbling around the edges with building front ends and other things like that to disguise some of the challenges we have. But again, I think technology plays a huge role in this CX approach. So a couple things just to highlight. Again, I mentioned that the PMA vision that came out yesterday, customer experience was a major focus of the PMA. We're going to see a lot that's going to come out on CAP goals, I think, on CX. I do believe there's also a CX executive order that's currently in the works in the administration, along with their efforts in the PMA. And then if you flip to Congress and what's going on there, there's several bills, one called Trust in Public Service that has a real customer experience focus. And again, this is more than, I like some of the things in the bills because it's more than just customer feedback, but it's really tying customer experience to the outcomes of the agencies and focusing on the right metrics to ensure that we have the right mission outcomes and a good citizen experience. And again, I just want to give the Social Security Advisory Board credit for the work that they have done from the expert panel and the focus on customer experience here. And then finally on the last slide, and I can go ahead and wrap this up with the last slide. I don't want to talk a whole lot about, but I do want to make a final point here on all these things that are going on. Obviously, there's a lot going on legislatively and from an executive branch policy. So data is another area. We have, the Evidence Act and focus on chief data officers. I think when that first came out, the Evidence Act of 2018, I think it actually was attached to the NDA in January of 2019. It focused on a lot of the big statistical agencies like Census and Bureau of Labor Statistics, but really all agencies, need to focus on better use of their data from budgeting to performance evaluation and performance management. And there's a lot of data strategies that are being put in place at many of the agencies. So one thing that I would like to just to mention here, and when we comment on, I know when I comment with some of my colleagues at MITRE, and we put our best folks together and we comment on like CX legislation or IT modernization legislation, Many times the specific, what I would call disciplines, the intent is spot on. But you get into all these requirements in an executive order or OMB guidance or legislation, and it's very important to make sure that these disciplines are working very well together. So, I would say, like back in the day, we're always concerned about CIOs working with chief acquisition officers, working with CFOs to make sure they're a unified team. Now we have chief information security officers, because many agencies have them along with CIOs. They need to be part of that team. But also the chief data officers and chief experience officers are now part of this equation. So again, I think what's really important for these agencies is that we have what I would call an alignment of the chiefs: CFOs, CAOs, CIOs, CISOs, CDOs, chief experience officers, and that we don't get stuck in stovepipes with some of the policies and legislation that are in place. So when I look at some of the legislation, like for instance, on the customer experience, I actually think it's important that that legislation cites the importance of technology and working with these other key players. And so the other thing that I would say, maybe to the Social Security Advisory Board, there's a strategic plan at agencies, there's an IT strategy, typically, there's a data strategy, there's customer experience approaches. And I think it's really important that we don't lose sight that all those key plans, again, aren't stovepipe, but there's an integration of the plans and then an integration of the management with all the chiefs that are involved. So that's something that I think if we stay focused on mission outcomes and realize the importance of these different disciplines, all this stuff is, I think, good. But again, we don't want to get into a compliance exercise and stay in these stovepipes. So that's the one thing that I think most agencies really need to make sure that these are managed effectively. And I hope that the PMA vision with the current administration highlights some of those things so that we have this better cross-pollination of these key disciplines going forward. So Bob, that's all I got for now, and open to questions.
Great, Dave. I just want to move us to the beginning of our questions, which is from our board. Just to remind everyone, we have 4 members of the board right now. We have Kim Hildred and Nancy Altman and Jagadish Gokhale. And without putting any of those 3 on the spot, I want to open it up for the board questions.
Jump in, Bob.
Yes, Kim.
First of all, thank you, David, so much for the presentation. Very, very interesting, always helpful. And I was wondering about a couple of things. First of all, I'm wondering about the impact of kind of how you all are thinking about the impact of many of the cybersecurity initiatives you've mentioned here, but the impact that telework has on them. Is that kind of just another layer of complexity to add over top of all of this, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's a layer of complexity, Kim, and a great question. And I do think this notion of zero trust, where it's not about perimeter defenses, right? We're all over the place right now. And we need to make sure that, right, this whole notion of this multi-factor authentication on the front end and the tools that we're using to do that, and, the focus on the strong passwords and everything. I think a lot of that has really been highlighted during the pandemic and with telework, to make sure that we got the right folks on our networks and the whole bit. I don't know about you, but I can remember, like, early on during the pandemic, we would get on a Zoom call and we're like, do we know who those 5 people are? We forget about being in our network, but it's just like they're on our call right now, right?
Uh-huh.
So I do think the notion of zero trust and where we're going with it, and these strong identity practices, I think fits nicely in with the challenges of telework, where we're still ensuring that the right people are on the right networks, and that we're clear. This whole notion of, like, don't trust anyone. So you got to really prove you're who you are, multiple times and everything. So that's where I think the zero trust approach is the right way to go. And I actually commend, I will say this, I think the administration with their zero trust strategy is being pretty aggressive. But again, I do think agencies are all over the board at different starting points. And this whole notion of prioritization and making sure they get out of the gate quickly, there's probably going to need to be some good discussions on that because agencies all are at different starting points.
Thank you so much. And then if I could ask you to imagine yourself as, you've got a lot of experience with the Congress, you've got a lot of experience working with federal agencies. But imagine if you were the head of Social Security right now, not the CIO, but the commissioner, okay? And you're faced with all of these new priorities relative to cybersecurity, but you're also in the process of modernizing your IT system. And there's a good possibility you may have a pretty big workload dumped on you by the Congress because of legislation that's passed. How do you go about prioritizing to be sure that everything's done?
It's a great question. Great question. And first of all, you used the right word, Kim. And that's where I think if you look at everything you could be doing from a cyber perspective, you're not going to, you can't do it. So you do have to prioritize. And that's why, like the comment we made to the administration on their draft zero trust strategy is, can you help agencies out of the gate on what's most important initially? Okay. And I'm with you. I mean, there's other federal agencies too, in addition to SSA, with some of those legislative requirements, IRS comes to mind, right? They're in a very similar boat where you're securing things and you got old systems and then oh, wow, look at what we were just asked to do. So that's all fine and good. But I do think, so here's the deal. You have no choice on cyber but to prioritize and do it because that's kind of almost a no-brainer, right? I think what typically ends up happening is the modern, because you got priorities, cyber priorities right now because it's everyone's on it. And I do think what takes the back seat many times is the modernization focus. And that's why I say we kick the can down the road. And so I really think like if when you look at how you modernize SSA's mission in the whole bit, what are the most important things you need to modernize like now, today, okay? And the other thing is sometimes like if you can't get it done in that budget year, you don't pursue it. So I've had discussions with folks like on the legacy challenges, like we really need to make this a priority, okay? Not just at SSA, but across the federal government. And again, it's just like zero trust. The modernization stuff, as you know, Kim, they're multi-year efforts. And the way we budget for them, you got to look at it from a multi-year perspective. And so like in the first year, if you turn the corner and start making progress, that's really good. Now, I know some folks say, well, that's not good enough because they want to see the immediate impact and finalization of everything. But we got to start turning the corner. So what I would do, prioritize my cyber stuff and really triage, how you tackle your cyber posturing. But I really think when you look at mission modernization, what are the top two or three top tech things that I think the secretary needs to be focused on? Here's what I like from an executive point of view. Many times we have so many things on our plate, we don't get anything done. Okay. So like, I love this discussion. I had this discussion and I'll give him a lot of credit for it. Chris DeRusha, who's the federal CISO right now. So I had this discussion with him. He said, Dave, I got two priorities. Zero trust. I want to push zero trust throughout the federal government. And the other thing is, and I love this, he said, I want to work with Congress on updating the laws and getting them more in line with the executive branch policies. And his thinking is that if I do those two big things, a lot of smaller things will take care of themselves. And I loved it. I just loved his prioritization. And someone could criticize him, say, oh, well, what about this? Okay, fine. Yeah, you could do that. But I like when you have two or three of those things. And that's what I would recommend, like from a cyber perspective or from a modernization perspective. And hopefully there's enough bandwidth to do two or three of those things and then still tackle those legislative mandates that are coming down the pipe, Kim.
Very helpful. Thank you so much.
Well, and Dave, you kind of anticipated a little bit in your answer my question, but let me ask you more directly and have you elaborate. And that is one thing that the public sector has that the private sector is not burdened by is Congress, change in administrations, change in, so that it is often hard to do multi-year because you've got an annual appropriations process and it can get turned around. Now, I believe Congress is getting a little bit more sensitive to that and providing in SSAs some multi-year funding, but also you have different administrations coming in with different priorities and so forth. How, I guess sort of a general question, if you could just reflect on that and how burdensome that is, whether there are ways to work around it. You've sort of begun to touch on it, but just how it, in
Yeah.
some ways the public sector is in some ways sui generis. So
Yeah, Nancy, so a couple things. I think the federal government's really challenged with the budget cycle, one, right? And you got changes in administration, changes in leadership in Congress. And I will say another thing that, to really pile on the cake here is that many of the key leaders don't stick around very long. Like we know the average tenure of a CIO is about 2 years. And I will tell you that many of the CIOs I work with, they kind of really get their legs under them at about the 2-year mark when they're, they got one foot. So what I would say to that, so you could sit there and say, okay, these are all these challenges, but I think that's why we really need to have, multi-year strategies in place. Like with what SSA has on their IT modernization, the 5-year plan, that's the type of stuff you need more of, but you also need to make sure that there's really good delivery on it too, right? Because it's about, you need the multi-year plan in place. So when you look at like a zero trust strategy or a roadmap, Nancy, we were talking about, I would say that those are going to be multi-year strategies. And we need to then make sure we're really clipping along on those zero trust strategies and roadmaps. Same thing with the modernization plans. You need multi-year, and are you going to have some hiccups because of budgets or other priorities? Sure, you're going to have it. But I still find that sometimes we put really good plans in place, in particular on IT modernization, and that all ends up taking the back seat almost constantly. And I think I fear that we're going to have like a major disruption, not to be like, but in a critical operation in the government, some of these systems are a big breach. And, is that what it's going to take to really put the right focus on it? So that's why, again, I commend like Senator Maggie Hassan for the focus she's put on it. And I hope she continues to go on it and have agencies really focus on that. But again, I would say it's about multi-year plans and sticking to those multi-year plans. The other thing, interesting, when we have the turnover too, Nancy, I will tell you this, these new folks come in and what do? They do another plan. And, sometimes there's depth secretaries that are there for longer and say, you know what, that plan we had in place is okay. You could tweak it, but I want to stay the course. So there needs to be some leadership. That's why when I look at all these chiefs and what they do and the data strategy and the IT modernization and the zero trust, those do need to come together like at the depth chief, like at a chief operating officer level. They really do need to come together at that level so you make sure that we have less of these starts and stops.
yeah.
But again, it's a major challenges, but I don't think it ought to be an excuse for progress because there's been times when agencies have done it. You can point to examples where we've done it. So, and that's what I always liked when I was at GAO too. Like, we did the FAR scorecard and we gave D's and F's, or, I wrote a negative audit report. I really like to focus on the A's and B's on a scorecard. And I also like to focus on in audit reports to have Congress ask me, well, what worked? Let me ask the agencies a question, what works, so we could dedicate part of an audit report to best practices and what worked. And I think you learn, I understand sometimes oversight does their oversight thing, but you learn a lot more from folks that succeed in the best practices out there.
Very helpful. Thank you. Very.
So picking up on the same themes, I mean, there's leadership turnover. There's turnover in the chiefs of these agencies. The agencies are at different starting points with regard to the new framework, zero trust, and so on that you've described. These are challenges and they're not going to go away. Yet we need to succeed in putting together these frameworks and systems so that we can get from point A, where we are, to point B, the goal, as quickly and efficiently as possible. And seems to me the hurdles, I mean, we've discussed this to death during the IT modernization report discussions that we had at the SSAB earlier. So, I mean, some of these problems are common across agencies. I mean, everybody needs to have an IT system nowadays. There's communication issues, telework has now become more important. All of those authentication, security challenges, securing your networks and so on. Some of these issues are common across all agencies. Everybody needs to do this. Why can there not be a centralized plan developed that can then be applied in a cookie cutter way, depending on where these different agencies are? Maybe you just may make an audit of these different agencies, assess where they are, what they need, and then apply the part of your cookie cutter system that you may develop independently, which then completely short circuits all these challenges with changes in leaderships, focus being driven to current delivery of services rather than IT mod for the long term and so on. All of these challenges will be short circuited. You develop a system where all of these issues are addressed, solutions are brought forth, and then you just apply them to these different agencies under a common framework. Why is that not possible? That's my kind of uninformed question to you.
So I think it is possible, and I think there are mechanisms that you could use. So as an example, the federal CIO's office, there's a CIO council. And I have seen that CIO council over the years. It hasn't always been consistent, but I've seen when the CIO, I'll give you an example, like back in the day when data center consolidation was all the rage, right? Everyone was focused on consolidating data centers and moving to the cloud. And we had certain agencies, 5 or 6 of them, that were kind of ahead of others, kind of the best in breed of really tackling the data center consolidation. The CIO council would get those CIOs together and they would talk about what worked for you. And there was a good, sharing across that. We could do the same with CISOs across the board. When we start looking at zero trust, what's going to happen there too. So if you look at that federal CIO position, or now we have a national cyber director, Inglis out of the White House, the question that I think is really important is at times, sometimes those OMB or EOP offices are policy organizations. They set policy and then there's not a lot that happens. What they need, when it really works, and we've seen it work, they set policy and then sometimes they actually put mechanisms in place to ensure that agencies move in the right direction. So as an example, like if you had a national cyber director and the federal CISO, make rounds with DEP secretaries on how they were implementing zero trust, elevating that discussion, if it's a priority to DepSec level, I think that really helps. So I think they can also point to your point, where there's been success stories, and we don't just have those success stories buried over at SSA in a closet, but that's shared with other agencies across the board so that we can replicate that. But I find that I think the OMB role is critical here when we have these big priorities across the government to ensure that we do share and that they're not just a policy group, I don't even like the word oversight. I think they ought to be set like metrics that help with successful implementation. There's sometimes the right metrics, and if there's follow-up, they could actually support them. Or, Kim, even back to your comments about, budget supporting that and everything. Folks are afraid to go talk to OMB about it, but you get OMB in your corner supporting your, approach to improve your, cyber security budget. Those are the types of things we need in the discussions we need to have on the Hill and at OMB. and be open and honest on where our challenges are. I find that many times we don't have those good budget discussions. And, and again, I think OMB plays a critical role in helping agencies. And I've seen it happen over the years. I've seen OMB really, when we had the OPM breach as part of that, right? Tony Scott was a federal CIO. He made his rounds, and everyone was focused at very high levels on making sure we didn't have an OPM incident in other pockets of the federal government. So again, I've just seen it work, and I think we could do that. So I think it's a great point you have, and we need to get those best practices out there.
Thank you.
Dave, I wanted to ask you, first of all, I wanted to thank you for your recognition of the work that we've done in the customer experience area. And what I learned from that, what our experts advised us, was that the various managers or management sections of Social Security need to align so that they have a common mission that includes cybersecurity and modernization, and leading towards the consumer experience and defining how that works together, and just keeping that on the table at all times. And as a non-sophisticated end user of these systems in the community, I'm constantly struggling with the demands of having services that are accessible to me when I have to remember, who my first dog's name was, and and all this stuff that, frankly, as I get older, I don't retain quite as well. And so, these are just the on-the-ground challenges that people have when they're having to navigate these systems. I wonder if you have any tips for the things that we can look at in basically understanding that efficiency and human behavior are not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah, no, Bob, I can totally relate. I forget a lot of those questions half the time too. And with the multi-factor authentication part of zero trust, that's not going to go away, because we've got to find multiple ways to identify ourselves. I do think the use of those biometrics, I mean, I love on my iPhone where I have my fingerprint allow for that. And I think more of the use of biometrics would help us who are more forgetful on some of these things. So I think there's some real sophistication that could occur with from a biometrics front to further help with this, identity and where we need to go with it.
Great. I'd like to ask staff, board staff, if they have questions.
I have a question for you, Dave. Speaking as a non-cyber expert, there's rarely a day that goes by where I don't get an email about a zero trust seminar. And so I had to sort of wrap my head around what that really means. And here's what I came up with, and I don't know if it's right. So when I think about zero trust, we used to think about, if you can cross the moat, you have access to the castle. Now, if you cross the moat, you get to the castle, you need to be able to get through every door within the castle.
Yeah, you're still not trusted. Right.
Right. So what makes that so difficult for federal agencies to accomplish? And what does that mean for the end user?
So I would say, when you look at what makes it so difficult, I don't know if it really is that difficult. I think there are multi-factor authentication and stronger encryption of our networks. We're not there across the board, but I just think it's really a maturing of where we need to go, Diane. I don't know if it's really that difficult. It's a matter of putting in place like these strategies to get there. I mean, we encrypt now, we identify now, right? Through passwords and other things. And what zero trust is doing, there's some sophisticated things with network segmentation and the whole bit. I get all that. But I do think, this is doable. It's more, in many ways, I think it's more of a management challenged because the technologies are kind of there to do these things. And what was the second half of your question, Diane? I'm sorry.
Just what does zero trust mean for the end user?
For the end user. So I don't know if it really, for the end user, I don't know if it should be, there should be much effect to the end user on it. We're having, I mean, other than, some steps on the front end, in terms of the response times and all that kind of stuff, we can do all this stuff. So from an end user perspective, I think we can secure and still deliver, timely information or whatever our systems are providing. But I don't really know if there's, I don't see any real negative effects from an end user perspective.
Thanks, Dave. Do we have other staff questions?
I have one question, and I guess it's about if there is a potential long-term CR, would that have any impact on cybersecurity efforts or IT modernization efforts with budget uncertainty? Is there anything?
Yeah, I think it, Conway, we always go through this, it typically does. And, things get put off or there's uncertainty. I know there's always a mad scramble. Is it going to get funded or not? And, CRs is definitely uncertainty. I think the CRs, and we're in a world where they just happen. I mean, it's almost like you plan for them now, right? But it does affect, if you plan for them effectively on the front end, you can do it, but there's always some questions about continuing to fund efforts with, contracts and those types of things. So CRs to me do have some negative impacts, and you just got to find ways to realize that they're going to happen, and you need to kind of navigate around them. It's unfortunate, but that's life these days, right?
Makes sense. Thanks.
Any additional questions in our last 3 minutes? Hearing none. Dave, thank you very much for participating in our speaker series. Your breadth of knowledge is really wonderful, and sharing that is a gift to us. So thanks again. We are going to be continuing with our next session with Jim Richburg at 2:45. And we urge you all to return to us. And we will get going at 2:45. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome, everyone, back to the board's FY 2022 speaker series. And for our next presenter, we are very pleased to have Jim Richburg, Fortinet's Chief Information Security Officer. Before joining Fortinet, Jim was the National Intelligence Manager for Cyber. He led the creation and implementation of cyber strategy for the 17 departments and agencies of the U.S. intelligence community, set integrated priorities on cyber threats, and served as senior advisor to the Director of National Intelligence on cyber issues. If that's not enough, Jim was also an executive team member who created and oversaw the implementation of a multi-billion-dollar whole-of-government comprehensive national cybersecurity initiative. Jim's broad operational experience, including his 20 years at the CIA, gives him a practical insight into complex cybersecurity problems, ranging from advanced threat capabilities to insider threat and supply chain integrity. As before, after Jim's presentation, we will open it up to our board members and staff for questions, followed by any questions that the public may have. And for that, again, you could use the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom menu. Jim's biography is available on our website and is added to the chat message. And so, Jim, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bob. And now the hurdle number one, let's try screen sharing. And here we go. So can you see? Foot in both camps.
Yes.
Now, why do I call it this? Well, as you said, Bob, I spent a full career in government. I was in positions that gave me a privileged look at technology and at threat. And I was often asked when I left government, when I went to Fortinet, one of the world's biggest, most advanced cybersecurity companies, what has surprised you in the transition? And I really realized that I had a foot in both camps, that I saw the world from both sides. So what I want to do is take this time to talk about what I see as the state of the art in cybersecurity and the art of the possible. And I very much want to make this interactive. I am going to cover a number of different things in the course of this talk. I'm happy to take your questions at any point in time. My formative years were spent at CIA, which not only was before we had PowerPoint, but we defined success as, did I answer the questions my audience had? Not did I successfully get to the end of my prepared briefing. So I would rather take this in whatever direction you would like, rather than say, Jim delivered all 20 slides. So, to that point, based on the things I did in government, and you talked about them, I've already alluded to them, there should have been relatively little that I would have expected to surprise me when I left government and went to the private sector about cybersecurity. And yet I fairly quickly learned that the public and private sectors were talking past each other on some fairly key things. And we in government had been so focused on trying to maintain our networks, dealing with the breach of the day, thinking about how to do that network modernization, that we somehow had failed to appreciate where the state of the art had moved in commercial cybersecurity capabilities, particularly with respect to artificial intelligence and machine learning, AI and ML, and the way that powers automation in cybersecurity. And for years, we would, from government, would go to our private sector partners, knock on the door and say, hi, you've been breached. We're from government, we're here to help you. But subtext to that was, look, these are your networks, this is your data. You don't want us on these. You should be the defenders of first resort. We in government, using the instruments of national power, are really the tool of last resort. Well, guess what? Whether it's because we talked to them, or I think more likely because technology evolved, they figured out a way to solve the problem, most of the problems. The challenge is we in government somehow failed to see that big strategic change. So this is what I want to talk about. I'm going to go through those areas where I think the two sides lack clarity. Some things where, frankly, I think neither the public nor private sectors appreciate what's going on, and that has implications for a large, complex organization like the SSA. We already talked a little bit about this in some of the questions in Dave's session. We're doing this virtually. The last 20 odd months has been transformational for good and bad. In a lot of senses, we're in this hybrid environment. I've commissioned some survey work about what the new normal is going to look like for IT enterprises and security. And I'll give you some of the advice that I give to organizations, public and private sector, when I talk to their C-suite executives, the CIO, the CISO, about cybersecurity. And then I'm a data guy. I spent my formative time at MIT and Stanford crunching numbers. I've been part of the evolution of metrics. How do you measure what you're doing in cybersecurity within government? Because the reality is, if you can't measure cause and effect, if you can't figure out what works and what doesn't, in terms of making programmatic adjustments, you might as well be throwing darts at a dartboard. And then I'm going to close with what I hope are some thoughts about IT modernization and security. And even if you just repeated some of the same questions you asked Dave, I think we'd have a lively discussion. So threat is one of the things that is often misunderstood, is abstracted in the private sector. We watch too many movies. We think, it's like it is in Hollywood, where you sit down, somebody writes a few lines of code, hits, compile, bounces through 20 servers around the world, hits the target, penetrates the network, and game over. It's a lot harder than that. We also tend to think that not only are the threat actors legion in number, which is true, there's a lot of bad guys out there, they all want what you have. We think that even the varsity, the sophisticated nation state programs, we ignore the fact that they're challenged for people, they're challenged for money as well. So number one, they can't go after an infinite number of targets. So I tell many organizations, unfortunately, Social Security would not be one of them, you don't have to be the most secure organization out there. You just have to be more secure than the likely other targets. They're going to go after the low-hanging fruit. You unfortunately represent or work with an organization that has the kind of crown jewels data that they will try and persist on. But even the varsity is only going to be as good as they have to be to get the job done. You may have heard of zero-day exploits, things that someone has discovered that is unknown to anyone as a vulnerability. The vendor doesn't know about it. The cybersecurity community doesn't know about it. You can run dark if you can use something like that. They're hard to find. And even when you find them, you're not going to use that tool if you look at your target and say, they're wide open to a common vulnerability that I can get off the dark web. I'm not going to be any better than I have to do to get the job done. Why waste my resources on that? Why risk exposing something? Supply chain. I call this a bad news, good news story, because the bad news is, yes, supply chains are highly porous and interconnected. The good news is it's actually harder to exploit those than, again, Hollywood would lead you to believe. It points you in the direction of things that are privileged, like network access, like cybersecurity tools. When I started talking about this 2 years ago, that was a revelation. Unfortunately, post-SolarWinds, everybody recognizes it. Again, we watch too many movies. Most cyber criminals are more like the would-be Darwin Award winners than they are the Ocean's 11 syndicate. Not to say that there are not some well-organized criminal gangs out there, but there's a lot of very opportunistic activity by these self-organizing groups. They may end up getting to the same point of effectiveness and efficiency as a nation-state program or as an organized gang, but they're noisier and slower doing it. Again, a lot of targeted opportunity activity happening out there. And increasingly, we're in a world where people are not hacking into your network and bringing malicious software, malware. They're using credentialed access, whether they get it from your employees, whether they get it from your partners. They're coming in and they're using the same tools that are on every computer and the servers to maintain them, a technique we call living off the land. Why bring something that you might scan for and find if I can use legitimate file copy functions and things of that sort? This is ironic coming from the guy who ran the insider threat program in government. I am not a fan of the term insider threat, just as I am not a fan of the term zero threat. We can have us hold that for the Q&A, because you want to avoid a threat. I'm not aware of any organization, public or private sector, that will be in business if it doesn't have insiders. I don't want to avoid them. They are my biggest asset. Rather, they are human beings. They make mistakes. They bring risk that I want to manage. And while every apple bushel of any appreciable size has a bad apple or two in it, and that certainly applies to a massive organization like the SSA, far more people accidentally cause harm than set out to do so. So having a program focused on managing and mitigating risk that can also help you find the few people who are being malicious is better than telling everyone, I am from the insider threat program. You are all potential threats. I'm waiting for you to step out of line. And then cyber threat intelligence. The private sector genuinely doesn't understand what that's about. I will admit I have bias since I ran that in the US government. I'll come back to that one later. Okay, so what does the government not understand as well? Well, digital transformation is certainly much more aggressively embraced and much farther along in most parts of the private sector than in government. And a lot of that has to do with the way we do procurement in government and the technology debt. You've got up to a 5-year procurement cycle. And I have done presentations to private sector boards where if they liked something we were talking about, could buy hardware and have it be in deployment within a month. 5 years, 3 to 5 years, in government was not atypical. And this is not all bad. We have fair and open procurement processes, but we also have this massive technology debt. We're always shooting 3 to 4 years behind the curve in government. We've missed that information technology and operational technology and OT are converging to the extent that they are in the private sector. Again, COVID, the pandemic, was a massive accelerator to this. I look at what GSA is doing. I look at where a lot of organizations in government are going. So some of these changes, these trends are starting to change. The fact that networks no longer have to be based on computers that are wired together, but whether can be defined by by literally software. Someone sitting down at one point in the country could define the network configuration for every Social Security field office, could maintain it that way. You could support users coming in, logging on from there, then going back home and still run it as a cohesive network. That's a trend that we in government are slow to recognize and we're slow to embrace. Now, what does neither side get? Well, they miss the fact that malicious activity, especially the things we try to mitigate and counter with cybersecurity, is conducted, at least to this point, by human beings. And the behavioral dimension of this is significant. Deception technology is something you may have heard of. You may have heard of honeypots, things that you can put in your network that will attract malicious actors because they have attractive name, something that makes it sound like this is the crown jewels, this is something sensitive, but yet a user will not stumble across these. These are hidden in out of the way places where someone who has succeeded in penetrating your network undetected, or an insider who's trying to find things to steal will find. And we often look at those from a cybersecurity perspective and say, do they help me find a problem I didn't know I have? Yes or no. We miss sight of the fact that they actually affect intruder behavior. We're all aware that if you have a sign in the window of your home that says these premises protected by X, it's going to deter some people from breaking into your house. And even if somebody decides to break in, the odds are really good that they're going to behave differently and proceed at a much slower pace than somebody who just goes, oh, Bob left the window open, I'm coming through that and exploring the premises. It affects the way you behave and how quickly you do it. It also, in cyber terms, has a deterrent effect. I funded some research when I was in government that showed that if you think there may be decoys there, you will behave differently even when they're not. And it has a benefit because things that we as network defenders forgot to protect may look so blindingly obvious as juicy targets that the suspicious intruder says, that's probably the honeypot, I'm going to avoid it. And we think there's probably some element of herd immunity to this. For an organization like Social Security, you would want to have this capability, you would want to deploy it enough that it is credible, but you don't have to put it everywhere all the time. It's just as in immunology. There's probably some number at which having it and having it be a real possibility is enough to give you most of the benefit without having to deploy it universally. But my experience is very few people, whether they're private sector chief information security officers or folks in government, which is ironically where this research was funded from, have recognized that we really need to think through this dimension of how decoys and deception can really give organizations, especially those who have high value assets to protect, like SSA, an additional control that they can put on the system. Any questions so far? I get on a roll, and I'm seeing a couple of head nods, but we'll keep going then. This is another thing that I find relatively few really appreciate, and that is the way this artificial intelligence and machine learning, AI and ML, have fundamentally affected things. Now, you may have heard of something we call CDM, Continuous Diagnostics and Monitoring, which is a government program. It's a variety of programs, but basically it's a way of saying we will continuously monitor the security of our networks and we will take mitigation actions based on that. I remember back in the day when continuous meant once a day, because at that point we were using FISMA, which was a paper-based audit of compliance once a year. So wow, you were cooking with gas when you'd gotten it down to once a day, and when you could actually give actionable advice on how to fix it. And then that National Cybersecurity Initiative that I was involved in helping to build and then to oversee was really predicated on these ideas of having first federal situational awareness within an agency, but then federating it across all federal agencies, certainly on the civilian side, to say, I know the health of my networks. I have a common operating picture of threat activity, and I can respond to it at machine speed. That's the holy grail of continuous diagnostics and mitigation that the federal government has been trying to build. And the reality was I presided over a program that poured nearly $20 billion with a B dollars into building great capabilities in some of the stovepipes within government. When I retired at the end of 2018, when we had a breach or an incident of any significance that crossed interagency boundaries, on a good day, we would be coordinating our discussion about incident response on a conference like on a video conference like this. On a normal day, we'd be on a conference call. So I left government thinking this was an unmet technological need, that we clearly needed to somehow figure out how to do this. And then as I joined the private sector, as I figured out what some of these innovative companies were doing, I said, oh my goodness, the same technology on big data analytics, that AI and ML, that's meant that as I type things in my cloud-based email, suddenly makes those themes start popping up in the banner ads beside my, that are running beside my email for the next week. Those same capabilities have crossed over into cybersecurity, and they're now being coupled with the ability to set policies and use automation to drive them at scale across the breadth of an enterprise. So what I've been trying to tell my former colleagues in government is, look, there are some very viable commercial solutions, or at least contributors to the way you might want to approach this problem of enterprise and federated situational awareness and cybersecurity in government. And the key to that is this artificial intelligence and machine learning. And that is a hyped term. That is a buzzword. I suspect I could put AI ML in front of a diet book and it would sell. So let me give a really simple example of AI and ML in practice, at least in the cybersecurity discipline. You get data from a variety of sensors measuring a variety of different phenomena. The first thing you have to do is you have to normalize it. I have to compare apples to apples. If I have something measuring apples, something measuring armadillos, and something measuring amoebas, I've at least got to say I'm functionally putting them on a like playing field so that I can look at what they're doing. And then in this example, let's say, okay, I want to look for evidence of bad activity. Hypothetically, let's say there are, at this point in time, 1,000 kinds of bad activity that a file could do. I'm going to say, yes, no, do I see each of these 1,000 things? Now, you're probably going to have weights associated with them because some of those bad activities are more important than others, but you're going to end up with a number. And then I'm going to reset and I'm going to say, so within this file, what are the elements that would map to something that's productive, or to use the old Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy term, mostly harmless? And then it's a math problem. I mean, I literally am going to say, so on balance, is this good or bad? I mean, this is not rocket science. This is neuroscience. This is the way your brain is wired to respond to things like fight and flight situations where I don't have to sit there and say, is that thing bigger than a bread box, and does it have fangs and does it have claws? You may get the decision wrong, but your brain is wired to act on stimuli, to run this kind of calculation very quickly and reach judgments. That's in a nutshell a way that AI and ML works in this field. And not only have the Googles and the Amazons of the world been doing big data analytics, the reality is the cybersecurity industry has been using this, not researching it as a science fair project, but actually using this kind of approach, these kind of algorithms for well over a decade. And the example I showed you was how you might use it to look at potentially bad software in malware analysis. We can use the same approach to look at websites. You've got 2 billion internet sites now. We're far, far past the days when you could say, for my user population, for my employees, I'm going to have a white list of good sites you can go to, a black list of bad sites you go to. Sites get corrupted and get repaired all the time. What I want is the ability to put in my browser the same kind of capability I just showed to say that, okay, before I let the user go to this site, what are the characteristics of bad? Is there bad content? What are the characteristics of good? Is this good or bad? Behavioral analytics is key, because I've already described how outsiders, malicious outsiders, and even insiders who are malicious are using the same kind of credentialed access. They may not be bringing bad things with them. You're looking for people who are misbehaving. So the ability to characterize behavior in real time and say something is out of the norm, and this is out of the norm, it is a precursor to something known to be bad, becomes really important. You may have heard of something called sandboxing, because with potentially malicious software, we recognized 15 or 20 years ago, rather than let it run on the target network, why don't I put it in a benign environment, create a virtual machine and run it in the virtual machine to see if this is a good or a bad piece of software before I let it be in my actual environment executing. Well, this has turned into a cat and mouse game, because the malicious actors quickly recognized the characteristics of virtualization. So we get smarter at hiding that they're not running on the real system. They get smarter and make it show a cat video instead of what they're doing. So the same approach to detonating a file, breaking it apart and putting it through is important there. And then all of these things that generate information. And what you are surrounded by is a sea of data, a torrent of data. You have to take all of the data from these different kinds of AI and ML themselves and normalize that. You have to turn the data into dots. You have to connect the dots, and then you have to make judgments out of that. In other words, produce threat intelligence. And the reality is virtually 100% of threat detection is now done by machine on an automated basis. And you may have heard of the 3 different modes. What I showed you was something where it would have been structured. You take the data, you run it through. We also have ways of taking general algorithms and basically letting the algorithm itself change to match the data, the best reflection of what it's seeing. Then you have reinforcement learning, where a human comes back and looks at what that unstructured learning produced and said, okay, you identified this cat as a dog. Throw that out, and the model goes back and says, okay, all of these cat-like things I'm going to throw out and change the model. And all of these things are being used, and they're making the artificial intelligence and machine learning for cybersecurity much more powerful. When you get to the point of enterprise scale things, the things that have to be run in those block-sized data centers, it's now extraordinarily powerful. We've also discovered, as it gets more powerful, you can get most of the capability from a subset of that. You don't need the big algorithm of billions and billions of computer nodes. You can have a tiny sample that can do 90% of the work, and with a small set of data. And what that means for an organization like SSA is, I recognize you process data in the administration that you're not willing to let even a trusted partner see. You're not even willing to let telemetry about that data go out of your possession because it's sensitive. But these same kind of capabilities can be forward deployed. You can get a hardware or a software appliance using this 10 years of progress the industry's made to say, okay, in my security operations center, in my data center, where my employees access my network, I can put these kinds of capabilities, and they can do a lot of the work that a human security analyst does, and I can even program them to respond on my behalf as well. So this is the kind of capability that industry has been developing that I suspect many people who are making these plans about cybersecurity and modernization in government, frankly, don't fully appreciate. Now let me switch gears for a second. That's the power of AI and ML. And I hope that I've made a case there for why that is transformational. Why do we say cybersecurity is hard? And usually one of the leading reasons is what we call the attack surface. The fact that digital transformation has meant more and more things are connected. We don't even understand how they're all coming together. The networks themselves are being increasingly defined on the fly. It's complexity and it's a lack of understanding. I'm not a fan of the term attack surface because, again, I want to avoid being attacked. I don't want to avoid digital transformation. It brings risk, it brings vulnerability, it brings something to manage. But let's set semantics aside. The workforce. I'm sure you're keenly aware that, depending on whose numbers you believe, we're 3 to 4 million people short of the desired number of cybersecurity professionals. And not only are we short on the number, the job continually changes. So these people need to reskill and upskill all the time. So the reality is, the people you have at any point in time, there are not enough of them, and they don't always have the optimal skills to get the job done. We're drowning in information. We're drowning in information. We're drowning in solutions. We're in a very problem-focused discipline. When people see a systemic problem in cybersecurity, some smart group of people will try to solve it. And if they come up with a solution that works, it typically becomes widely adopted. The problem is we're really slow to retire solutions, in part because you only get more problems. Old problems don't go away. But the reality is, for a complex organization, and I would put the SSA in this category, I would not be surprised if in the Security Operations Center for SSA, you didn't have upwards of 75 different cybersecurity tools, each pointed at a different cybersecurity problem, all reporting data in, much of which didn't talk to each other. The poor human is having to integrate and be the slave to the machine to make sense of all of this. So we have solution overload, as well as we're drowning in more data than we know what to do. But what if you took that surface, call it an attack surface or call it the vulnerability surface, and you instrumented it? And the instrumentation were devices that were sensors that were capable of reporting on what they were seeing that related to cybersecurity, to that kind of smart AI and ML that I've described. And then the devices that were sensors were also controls that, when directed by that AI and ML, could take action. That's what we call a security platform. I mean, and it's a misleading term in the sense that when you say platform, sometimes people say, oh, you mean what phone am I using? Or is it my desktop computer? Or is it the cloud? No, this is a way of saying it's an ecosystem. A fabric is what my company calls it. Gartner's new term is a mesh. But this is a way of saying I want interoperability across all of the parts of my network, across all of the parts of my digital infrastructure. Things should be able to talk to each other. Things should be able to send tipping and queuing of commands and respond. And now that's the premise. And I'm going to now show you an example. NSS Labs was probably the closest thing we've had in the cybersecurity industry to a Consumer Reports. They did independent, rigorous testing, unbiased testing, transparent methodology. And in 2019, at the request of their customers, we said, we're hearing about this thing called platforms, and we want to test it. So they set up a network. They took live threat data from the dark web, and they replayed it against networks defended by a lot of the leading commercial solutions. They also created their own test data. They basically made zero-day exploits, and they had as many as 13 different layers of obfuscation to try to hide it. And that's a high bar, guys, because the reality is nobody's perfect against something they've never seen before that's trying to hide from them. So when they tested the firewalls, they were roughly 90% effective at preventing the network from being breached or discovering that a breach had occurred within 15 minutes. When they used endpoint products, we call them intrusion prevention systems, the things that you put on your computer, the things that you put on your phone, they were, as a class, somewhat more effective. Now, let me hasten to say that doesn't mean an endpoint product is more valuable, more versatile, more useful than a firewall. If anything, the converse is true. This is testing bias. If I'm trying to keep something out of a network, something that stopped it at the network perimeter was preferable to something like a firewall that deals with data in the core. But the genuinely interesting thing happens when you take the same characteristics that are represented in the blue and the green circles, and you allow them to be knit together by AI and ML to talk to each other. They rise as a class in effectiveness. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And because cost drops as you move to the right on this graph, not only did these things become more effective, they became more cost effective as well. One of the solutions dropped 75% in relative cost. Now, you look at this and say, okay, but the highest thing on here, even for one of those integrated ecosystems, is only 98, 99% effective. I'm getting hit by millions of threats a day. A lot of things are still getting by. Remember, this is a proof of concept. The simplest system is 2 elements. The reality is most organizations are going to have 5, potentially 10 or more different things in their security environment, all talking to each other. The synergy gets you closer and closer to 100, the higher you go. And when you put this together, this platform approach with the power of AI and ML, this is what I look at as a game changer. It's this convergence between the two that enables it, that I think is the transition that most of us have missed. Now, I played offense. I ran lawful collection programs during my time in the intelligence community. And I've got to tell you, even the best out there, we're not cyber ninjas. We're not invisible. We make mistakes. We typically try and fail innumerable times before we succeed in getting into a target. Now, we hope, number one, that our failures are going to just look like anomalies rather than intentional activities, but we also rely on the fact that the defender can't be looking everywhere all the time. So we hope we're hiding in plain sight, that they simply missed us. But even if they did detect it and an alert sounds in the Security Operations Center, the reality is most security operations centers get more false alarms, more false positives than genuine alerts in the course of a day. So the odds are this is a false alarm. But even if they look at it and say, well, this is probably a real threat, you don't know how significant it is. You don't know what to do about it. So the attackers are not invisible. They're not operating faster in most cases than the network defender. It's human against humans. They're relying on our systemic disadvantages. Well, put the sensor to work. The sensor never blinks. It never goes out for coffee. It's doing this kind of correlation. It's now putting the onus back on the attacker. We're watching them try and fail before we watch them succeed. And this is an arms race. It is a big data arms race. And I will concede there are niches where artificial intelligence and machine learning will asymmetrically help the attacker. For instance, we're all familiar with spear phishing, right? Emails that are sent to you to attempt to get you to either go to a website, click on a link, open the attachment, and get co-opted. That is something where there's commercial, well, not even commercial, open source artificial intelligence software that from a small sample can generate content that an AI expert can't tell you didn't come from a human. So look for spear phishing now that not only takes your identity and your address book, it takes your emails so that it's going to come out with one that reads like I might talk to Bob about the things I would talk to Bob about with the syntax that I would use. That's going to get a whole lot harder, but that's a niche case. On balance, work with me on the premise that who's going to know more about a network? The people who set it up and are administering it and defending it, or the people who are trying to attack it from the outside as a black box. This is a net advantage to the defender. This is turning that attack surface, that complexity, to our advantage. It enables the law of large numbers and automation to work in our favor. We're making, if you will, a synthetic collection antenna that's able to see the bad guys trying. It's able to see them trying one place and say, I know what you're trying to do, stop it where they're doing it and block it everywhere. In fact, these approaches are global. These families of ecosystems of capability are literally global, which means an organization like SSA benefits from things directed against other parts of the federal government, other sectors of the US, and even other countries. So the analogy I use is if this kind of approach were somehow applicable to the pandemic, while patient zero in Wuhan was fighting some infection, the cyber equivalent of WHO would have said, I see what's happening, I've developed a vaccine, and I'm inoculating the rest of the global population. That's why I look at this as a game changer, because you get this breadth of visibility, you get the ability to see individual things running in memory on a particular box, and you get this real-time control. Visibility and control are the attributes you need for zero trust. You asked Dave a lot of questions about zero trust. When you put this together, it minimizes the chances of an organization getting penetrated at any moment in time. And then if you implement it as a precursor to zero trust, it then minimizes the consequences of that kind of penetration. And that's why, again, I spent time in government. I ran multi-billion-dollar programs. We always had a number of different factors that we would consider when we were awarding contracts, but the reality is it was usually some combination of the two big P's, price and performance. I think we need to recognize these things called platforms are real and they exist, and we ignore them at our peril. If you look back to the NSS chart that I showed you, even the worst thing running in that red circle would outperform the best of breed, the best in class non-integrated solutions. Now, what we weren't testing in that NSS example was the fact that the ecosystems aren't equal. They're not equal in what they're focused on. They're not equal in their depth of maturity, but the reality is any platform is better than none. I've had this ironic conversation with some people in government who've said, Jim, you've convinced me platforms are real. But the reality is I don't know enough to know what the best choice for my agency is at this point in time. So I'm going to hedge my bets. I'm going to buy one from platform A and one from platform B. And I'm going, look, pick one. I don't care which one. You're not getting, all you're doing is avoiding synergy. You're just making sure you never get to that red circle. And when I say a platform family, these are in no case something that means it has to come from one vendor. These are broad ecosystems. I mean, the one I'm most familiar with, there are over 400 different solutions from different vendors that are all part of this ecosystem with varying degrees of integration, to be sure. But this is not something that says, go forth and buy from Acme. This is a matter of saying, you'd be surprised at the number of things that can talk to each other. So recognize these things exist and factor that into your thinking as you think through your cybersecurity plans. Any questions to this point? I'll keep rolling then.
Thanks.
Okay. So, and again, you asked some questions about this already of Dave. We're doing this virtually in recognition of the dramatic changes that have occurred. Hybrid is here to stay. I've funded 2 rounds of survey research. Nobody's going back to the office full time. There's 25% of the people who like being in the office, but even they don't want to be in the office all the time or be forced to be in the office all the time. So organizations are looking at an instantiation of continued work patterns that look this way, and the workplace itself is changing. There, by about a 3 to 2 margin, organizations are consolidating the number of locations they have. I don't know how applicable this is to an organization like SSA with field offices, but at least in the private sector, they're downsizing. The functions of some of the offices is changing. We have certainly seen the way service was delivered change as a result of COVID. You may be familiar with the term RPA, robotic process automation. The simple one is you go to a website and there's a chat bot. I log on at 3 a.m. and I get Mark saying, hi, can I help you? Mark is not there at that company waiting eagerly for me to type keystrokes. It's an AI engine. It's robotic process automation. State and local government in particular had to roll this out at scale in 2020. It went from something that perhaps 5 or 6 states were using in January to something that everybody was using by June, because when unemployment insurance applications spiked by 3,000%, they didn't have enough staff who were now working from home to deal with this, absent that ability to use chatbots, to direct calls, to answer simple questions, to provide the simple things like, oh, you need this form, and then send it to them. We're now starting to see the descendant of RPA, which is basically a way of saying, I'm going to automate rote tasks that a person does. We're now applying the AI and ML to say, I want it to be intelligent automation. I want it to notice, something is missing here, or when this person normally asks about X, most of the time they then go on to ask about Z. So let me, position it for that. So we're going to see a continuation of automation, both in terms of customer facing applications. And you've talked about, you've done studies of the customer experience here. The federal government accelerated its use of RPA in back office functions more than in customer facing organizations. Things like enterprise resource planning, other accounting packages were things where they tended to use more of this. I think in part because other than agencies like SSA, federal government does much more inward facing work than outward facing, but RPA is here to stay. So is OT, operational technology. We saw a dramatic rise in this, both in private sector, but increasingly we're talking about smart buildings. GSA is committed to having green energy in every federally leased building by 2025, and for all new construction to have carbon neutral footprint by 2030. You don't get there without operational technology that is not increasingly connected to the rest of the network. Public health, we're talking about new HVAC systems, new ways of monitoring for new types of pandemic problems. All of this kind of automation is here to stay. You have to secure it because we've recognized these devices In many cases, do not have security built into them. You can't patch security into them. So you need to have ways of securing them upstream when they hit the network themselves. The ironic thing is, not only did we get into hybrid work patterns, the threat actors went hybrid on us as well. We're increasingly seeing one kind of activity that represents multiple kinds of threats. You're all familiar with ransomware. I mean, ransomware has become coffee table conversation in this country this year. Well, ransomware in January was largely a threat that came in and encrypted your data and then extorted you. Now, more ransomware than not only encrypts your data, it steals it. That's a second entire thing, because I'm going to threaten now to either publish it, I'm going to turn around and sell it in the case of something like SSA's data. The threat is becoming hybrid. We're starting to see code, computer code, that actually is modular and is compiled from the best performing portions of other computer packages. If one malware family has a really effective way of penetrating a network, and another one has a very clandestine way of expanding laterally, and a third one has a very successful way of exfiltrating data, we're now starting to see, you can't quite call them cut and paste, but they certainly are hybrids. It's like as if Dr. Frankenstein had set out to say, you know, I want to have the fastest monster in the world. I'm going to the Olympic athlete graveyard to get my body parts from. So the threat itself is changing as well. And the real implication is, what does this mean for IT and security? And what can government do in response? I got through that really quickly. I normally give an entire talk about hybrid and what you do about it. But what I tell people is, you know, the platitude is spend smarter. And the reality is, that's a bumper sticker. I mean, we've all been there, we've got that, and we need to move on. So I put that in practical terms and say, the private sector, again, they don't have your protracted procurement cycle. So some people are already spending money. Let's look to what the early adapters are doing to the hybridized environment. You know, not going to say what the private sector does is one-to-one applicable to government, but let's at least figure out what people who run large, complex enterprises are doing to try to secure theirs, and how to do IT modernization. Leverage the platform approach to cybersecurity. I think I've already dwelt on that in enough depth that I don't need to hit that one anymore. And then the third one is partnership, developing and leveraging trusted partnerships. And I'm going to build all three of these out. Unfortunately, there's no such thing as a free lunch here. I know I was part of government where they said, spend smarter, do more with less. We're now at the point where you can't do more with less. You've got to do more with more. And when, again, I was part of a team that developed and ran 2 rounds of surveys in the private sector. And the reality is, most organizations are actually going to spend their increase IT spending to deal with the digital transformation in the hybrid environment. Their focus really is on resilience. We saw so many organizations say, we didn't have the bandwidth, we didn't have the IT staff. These were the challenges we faced in the pivot to remote. These are the challenges we're going to face as we continue to go to a status quo that's not like the status quo ante. They're making architectural changes. They're certainly moving in the direction of cloud and that software-defined networking that I discussed. Their hiring priorities are a good news, bad news story from my perspective. The good news is they're trying to make systemic changes, hiring people like architects. They're not just saying, I need to hire more analysts, I need to hire more people and put on the help desk. They're really trying to change the way their networks are architected. The bad news story is, these are the areas that are among the most acute shortage that we face right now. But let's be creative. For an organization like SSA, OPM has been changing the hiring authorities. Can you find people like this who aren't located near SSA headquarters, who may still be willing to work full or part-time for the administration on projects like that? Even more organizations are planning to increase their security spending than their overall IT spend. And they're recognizing that we all made the pivot to remote. We made the pivot because of IT and security working lockstep to enable it. The sad part is we could measure whether we got to the success line on the IT side. Did everybody end up with a collaboration platform that worked? Did we have the bandwidth so that people weren't freezing up, and but we couldn't measure our success in cybersecurity, and we paid the price. We actually saw malicious activity coming in through these home users rise 1,000% between the middle of last year and the middle of this year, because the reality is small office, home office networks are not enterprise grade security. You've got people who don't run basic cybersecurity protections at home. Nobody, I'd say almost nobody, updates the firmware, the things that actually power your firewall and your router. Most of us don't even know how to do that. So the criminals and the malicious actors recognize this as a soft underbelly. And the way we were operating as organizations, and I suspect SSA was in this boat too, is we sent people home with government issued equipment. We gave them two-factor authentication, so I can make sure it's really you logging on. And then we probably gave them a secure connection, a virtual private network, a VPN back to the agency. And then we were basically treating them as if they were logged on from their desk. And the reality is they were not. They were logged on from this environment with other family members doing who knows what, with IoT devices, Internet of Things devices that are connected in. And we have discovered, and this is, I think, one of the accelerants to that zero trust conversation, to the executive order that Dave alluded to say, look, we can't just say, I validated you are who you say you are one time in a session and we're good to go, because bad things can still happen. I need to make this much more dynamic, much more granular, much more interaction. Zero trust is increasingly important. We also noticed that a lot of these organizations in the private sector, and this does not apply to SSA, are outsourcing a lot of these things. We have something called Security Orchestration and Response, SOAR, Advanced Analytics, Suspicious Incident and Event Management, and Security Operations Center as a Service. I can't see SSA outsourcing any of this, but this is something where a lot of people have recognized in the private sector there are economies of scale, and some of these problems are hard enough. Finding sophisticated third-level analysts to do some of this is something that not every organization can afford, but these ecosystems can afford to do it. So that's the way the early adopters in the private sector have been dealing with some of this. The reality is, for every challenge, there's an opportunity. And we only succeeded in making the pivot because IT and security were able to work hand in hand, and because we were able to demonstrate that we were indispensable to the organization. And I think this is a matter of saying you can get beyond, and some of the questions that I was hearing in the last session about, well, how do we deal with security versus IT modernization? Look for areas where the two converge. Look for things that will allow you to have your cake and eat it too. And increasingly, I would put things like software-defined networking in that area. Software-defined networking is saving companies in the private sector immense amounts of money. The fact that you can have a complex organization where, the one I'm familiar with, 1,200 different field sites that used to have dedicated wires running to, separate wired infrastructure in each one. Somebody had to go around the country and maintain the local area networks. And for that dedicated line, a T1 line that you're paying a managed provider for, that's between a 50th and 100th the bandwidth you and I have on this kind of connection that we're probably doing wirelessly. So you're paying more for a fraction of the bandwidth. You can maintain this stuff centrally, you can redefine it, you can say, okay, my users need to prioritize doing applications like this, give them the bandwidth. Let's turn off not turn off social media, but I don't care if Facebook takes longer to update. I'm going to prioritize this because this is mission important. It's a win-win thing because the users notice this is good. The organization certainly notices they have the flexibility to work from anywhere when they need to. And this is an example where, go down to my second point there, we're increasingly getting to a world where the same product is both the one that provides the software-defined networking that the IT guys are going to say is foundational to their IT modernization, and it's a part of the security solution. We've had 3 generations of software-defined networking products. And the first one is it's just about moving the bits and bytes. It's just about saying, I don't need wires anymore. I can do this by software. But the reality is, because it didn't have anything to do with security, you ran the risk that somebody didn't do security. They connected directly to the internet without a firewall. We know bad things can happen when you do that. So the second generation was to say, okay, I need to kludge security back into this, whether it's in that local network before it goes to the great internet, or whether it's an enclave before I hit the broad internet. I'm going to, introduce complexity, but I'm going to solve it. And then the third generation really is to say it's one solution, whether it's a box or whether it's a software product. It's one thing that does the networking and does the security. And because it's the latest generation, not only does it allow you to avoid that dichotomy, that choice between security or performance, it's usually better in each of its constituent functions. It's faster on the networking side. It allows you to do self-healing when there's a problem, and it gives you the ability to do more sophisticated things on the security side. So my advice is look for those things that are win-wins, where you can get IT and security saying, I like this solution. It's the same solution to both of our problems. And then the third big point I make is you can't go it alone. The number one thing I hear when I talk to people in government and the private sector is strategic advisors. They say, I have no shortage of people who want to come in and sell me solutions or tell me about new technologies. But what I'm really looking for is somebody who can tell me about threats that are over the horizon, who can tell me about best practices that extend beyond my peer group, the kind of things I'm trying to do here. This is something that in the private sector and in government, small organizations especially need this because they don't have the breadth to do this. But I've discovered even in very large organizations, they like someone who can bring a complementary perspective. So that's the number one thing I hear is I'm looking for a source of trusted advice and counsel. The second one, which I already alluded to, is cyber threat intelligence. I ran the intelligence community, and the biggest three-letter agency out there didn't have enough data, didn't have enough analysts, didn't have enough understanding of context, either of what was being attacked or who was doing it, to say, I got this, I don't need any help. It's genuinely about partnership, especially for an organization like SSA, where you've probably got your own threat analysts who are curating and looking at the data coming in. But the reality is almost all the threat data we get is generated, as I said, in the AI and ML part of this discussion, by machines. It's consumed by other machines. But then the human gets involved when you start saying there are patterns here. This is an adversary, and they're using tactics, techniques, and procedures. I can even divine an intent. If I know who it is, I may know how sophisticated they are. You're putting together a playbook of what my bad actors are doing to me that can then inform a playbook of how I want to respond. You can use the sports analogy and say it's like the offense and the defensive line both need plays to be able to run. And then there's strategic intelligence, information about indications and warnings, something that's happening that is significant enough that leadership needs to change, make a decision about changing the way an organization needs to operate. And organizations, especially in government, need all three kinds of intelligence. You need the strategic, you need the operational, but overwhelmingly, you need the tactical intelligence. And the third part of this is the partnership piece. And this is really where I started the whole conversation, that in government, we have, and I can't call it hubris, but we're so focused on solving our problems, the problems of support we have to provide to the citizenry of the nation, that we miss the broader picture. And a lot of us are just very problem solution focused. Not everybody is a strategic thinker in the first place, but people say in government, say, I'm going to go solve problem X. And then the first thing they want to do is solve it themselves. And I go, look, please, don't reinvent the wheel. Let's start and see if the tire shop has got a set of wheels that are pretty close to my size, or that I could do a few modifications for, at least would give me a point of departure. But don't go it alone. That's my parting advice on that. And then I want to switch gears again, but this is like a smorgasbord. If you don't like course A, wait 5 minutes, you're going to get course B. Any questions pertaining directly to that one, or we can hold and go on to this, because now you've gotten into the third thing that I lived through in government is, Bob, you're off mute, go on.
Please proceed.
Okay, so this
I
is
do have a question, if I may.
You may. I would rather get it now rather than at the end, and that's why I keep trying to remember to say, stop me if you want to say something.
So I'm going to take your advice earlier and ask the same question I asked David. essentially, I read your presentation to indicate that agencies in the federal government should not go it alone. And so there needs to be an umbrella agency that provides, when you're saying seek out strategic partners for advice and so on, the government itself can organize this activity and provide agencies with advice depending on what starting point they're at. And that would be more efficient. I don't know what you thought of, whether you heard my question earlier.
Yeah.
I think I was more articulate then than I am now. But
No,
anyway.
it sounds good. And I absolutely, I recognize where you're coming from. The issue we continually ran into in the time that I was in government is the funding is aligned by agencies, so you end up with an authority responsibility mismatch. We even had this problem within a single agency saying, I want one CIO or one chief information security officer. The reality is if they had multiple colors of money, he who controls, it's the golden rule, right? He who has a goal gets to set the rules. So you're either going to put somebody in the position of dictating to other agencies without having 100% appreciation of their particular mission, or somebody can flat out just say, it's my money. I have my own legal mission with my own legal sets of authorities. I'm going to do what I do. We had this issue even with DHS getting permission to scan the public facing internet parts of agencies' websites. They weren't even allowed to do that without negotiating individual MOUs with each agency to say, even though the public can go look at this, because they were being asked to say, are we vulnerable to certain common problems? And they couldn't even do simple things like that. That is why, in one sense, they created CISA to help quarterback this, but that's also why you've got the Chris English role at the White House to try to be a coach for some of this, and Jen Easterly at CISA as a quarterback. We never succeeded in getting Congress to, no one wants to give up control with their committee, so everybody's going to fund their agency their way. The agencies are going to do their thing, but I absolutely agree, rationalization, consolidation of services is the way to go. And I think we're starting to see with the executive order with saying, accelerate the migration to the cloud. Whether it's a private cloud, whether it's a hybrid cloud, whether you're going to use one of the half dozen existing public cloud providers. But oh, by the way, we're going to put out a technical reference architecture on how you should do this. We're trying to make practical steps to get in that, to move in that direction.
Okay, I think I understand basically where you're coming from. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's one of these things we always said this sounds good, and it always ran into the practicalities. Just like we would say, responsibility needs to devolve to the top. So when there's a major problem with security in an agency, the agency head should be responsible for it. They should stand or fall. I can think of 2 times in my 30 years in government where I saw someone actually get fired as an agency head over security breach. The reality is it doesn't roll up to the top. So theory and practice don't meet.
The thing that occurs to me is like OMB sets all these standards and goals in their documents for cyber and modernization and whatnot. And that you have a certain time, you got to meet these goals by this deadline and so on. But I think that alone is not sufficient, because then it runs into all these problems that I outlined earlier about leadership changes, priority changes, service delivery needs, and so on. So why not, along with setting goals and standards that have a drop dead date, why not also have an agency that will deliver cookie cutter solutions that will help agencies to meet those? Now, they don't have to be comprehensive. Like you take this and it's going to deal with every problem. That's probably not possible. But certain areas of meeting some standards and goals that OMB is setting provide tools along which are developed and vetted properly at a central location, rather than duplicating all these efforts in all the different agencies, because all of them need to do some standardized. Some functions are common across everything. And that's what I'm trying to get at.
We've done that. And the problem, OMB can set these things out, but they are unfunded mandates. OMB Yeah, OMB creates your requirement to do something. And that was the whole problem with EO 14028. A lot of very ambitious things to do. And OMB said, churn the money for the first year, and then we'll go ask Congress for money for the out years. That is the real problem to that. But to your point, there have been things where GSA has been able to put together something like the trusted internet connection thing to say, look, we can rationalize and offer as a service a secure way for all the civilian branch agencies to connect to the internet. The big ones can hold their own. The smaller ones can either go through a big one or you can go through one of the 4 big commercial providers. So we have been finding ways to do this and to offer it as a federal government-wide service, but not across the board, not an Uber agency funded to be the service provider for everybody, but in things like the Trusted Internet Connection Initiative, which is on its 3rd generation, that really did take that approach of providing this, at least the consistency of approach, but for many agencies saying it's a service. You have to pay for it, but it's a service.
Thank you.
Jim, this is Kim Hildred. I'm one of the board members. I'm curious as to whether you might have any specific advice for what SSA can do to, speaking of money, to work with the appropriators to try to get the funds they need.
You dropped out there on me, Kim. Unless it's just me, I lost you at the funds you need, but we had good luck when we were dealing with the national. First, I want to make sure, Bob, can you guys still hear me? It's
Yes,
not a problem at my end. So Kim just locked up. We had good luck when we were able to come down to the Hill with consistency of message. On the big national cybersecurity initiative, they actually applauded us for saying, not only did you come down lockstep in big hearings, when we had small ones, subcommittee hearings, nobody turned on anybody else, at least for the first 3 or 4 years, and said, give me their money because I can do things better. So to that point, I think coming down and showing the appropriators that you've got a comprehensive vision and is going to be key, and to show them the kinds of efficiencies to say, look, what I'm doing here helps both IT modernization and security, and it's consistent with the implementation of this executive order. Coming down and saying this is not singular, but this is multi-purpose. You give me this money, and it's a gift that will accomplish multiple things in my agency. Would be my top of off the cuff way of saying I would handle that if I were the SSA administrator trying to go down and make that case.
Just to follow up, I think
Yep.
on the same thought is that it seems that, I think you mentioned earlier that, I don't know if it was low hanging fruit, but that's SSA has a lot of fruit that bad guys would like to have. And so it seems like it offers a great proving ground for experimentation and implementation that can benefit other agencies.
It does. I mean, I look at SSA as, and it's funny, before this started, I said, put my old black hat on of somebody who, had to do this. I would put an organization like SSA, depending on what kind of data I was looking for and for what purpose, in either my top 3 or maybe top 5 list of targets to go after. You're that important, and you don't want to be the next OPM. I lived that one. So yeah, you need to defend yourselves as an administration against both the casual guys and the really persistent guys. So you are the proving grounds to say we can have all of these interlocking things. Nothing's perfect, but we're going to raise the bar. We're working with our partners in government, in the national security and law enforcement community, to try to stay ahead of the emerging threats. You are one of the poster children, to say we have assets. I mean, for crying out loud, in terms of personal identifying information, what is more valuable than the Social Security number? I mean, you've got the crown jewel data, and I think you're in a position to say we have to defend it against all comers.
Go ahead, Bob.
No, please, Nancy.
Did you have a follow-up? Because I have a question that's related to what you just asked, and that is, I've really thought for a long time, I've wondered about the fact that, as you and Bob were just talking about, what Social Security data, it's the dream of hackers. There are a million scams all the time. Social Security, for the first 40 years of Social Security's existence, the agency was always on the cutting edge of technology, partly because it had to be, because there were no insurance companies or anyone else that did anything on the scale that Congress wanted Social Security Administration to do. And so they always had the top, as I said, the lead, the cutting edge. And then it really stopped. You know, we all hear about the COBOL language and so forth, that they really fell behind. I don't know if you have any theories about why that happened, but to what extent is the public sector even close to the cutting edge at this point? Is it all coming from the private sector? And of course, you do have huge, or multinational. You do have much larger enterprises now, so it may not be that the government is on the edge, but certainly on the importance of the information it holds and so forth. It should be, it strikes me, on the cutting
Yeah,
edge.
I think we are 50 to 70 years beyond the point where government drove innovation across the board in IT. It's just the way it is.
Definitely.
Now there are these niches in the national.
But do you know why? Do you know
Uh,
why that it changed?
Because everybody, it started to become a broader set of capabilities. I mean, government, as you pointed out, was early to the data processing game. You know, the first mainframes were in either
Yeah.
research institutes or in government. But then this became something that became increasingly useful across society. And now I think, other than niches in national security in my old world in intelligence, where we can afford to drive beyond the state of the art, we're now following the trail set by the private sector. But don't forget the power of the purse. We can still sometimes say, because of our mass as the federal government, when we set standards, procurement standards, I'm not talking about carrots and sticks of, I'm going to create a requirement for something. It's a big enough market that people will try to meet it. And we're not unique. It's a twofold problem. We're not unique in the kinds of data I think SSA deals with. So you've got, smart solutions for cloud data management, for ensuring the integrity of data, because you've got these big multinational corporations that have got data that's spanning the world. You don't know whether you trust all your workforce. You need to ensure the integrity of the data. Now, there are companies out there that have got, assets that they would argue are worth more than, somebody's social security file. So I think we can look at some of the lessons learned on that, but also I think we do have the economy of scale of saying, if you do the equivalent of what we did on the trusted internet connection, there may be times when you can say the agencies that have large data problems, distributed data problems or centralized data problems, we may want to be able to put together not a collective contract, because we're each going to be singular, but I think you have enough mass behind the federal government as a market that you can drive innovation more than we often think. But we're not driving the R&D anymore. I'm sorry, that's probably not in our working lifetimes was that the case.
Yeah, but you think it could be, it's something to aspire towards, but it's not there now.
I think we're better off setting cybersecurity standards and saying, I need it to do the fight. Driving IT innovation, the companies that, between the four of them that are a quarter of the stock market, game, set, and match, they've got it. They've got the money, they've got the talent. That's just, don't try to undo that one.
Yeah.
But I think we can still make the case for cybersecurity. And that's where things like the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the things NIST comes out with as standards for government, resonate with the private sector, sometimes become the baseline for international standards. So there are things we do from a public sector lens that replicate more broadly. And I think we can do the same things with some of the cybersecurity things. If you say there's a unique, not even a unique, but an SSA mission on security, can I meet it first off from some of these private sector offerings? Or if I can articulate the problem in a little different sense, is somebody going to A, meet it, and B, say, wow, I see other markets for that, so I'm going to continue to mature that kind of technology.
No, that's interesting. I mean,
I wouldn't give up hope.
Do you think there's anything that's sui generis, either with Defense Department, even if it's not SSA, or you think it all really, the what's being done in the private sector can be, that it all works together? Or is there anything that's...
I think with both, because, and again, as important as we want to say the data we're dealing with is, look at some of what the Defense Department's doing, look at what some of the medical field doing when it's literally real time and people die when you get it wrong. There may be lessons that we can draw to more static environments like ours.
Thank you. It's very interesting.
Jim, we're coming up very close to the end, and I'm wondering if you have closing remarks.
I do. Let me just skip through the third part, which was just about metrics, because I've lived the evolution of metrics. But these are sort of my final thoughts that I did want to end on, which was, this is the opportunity as you think through what this is all going to mean to say, I want to tell them we need to look at least things like these platforms, that we need to find ways of systematically embedding AI and automation across the workforce, across our customer experience as well. You're in a world where you're going to have both physical offices, field offices, you're going to have a distributed workforce. You're a poster child, along with a few of the other large agencies, for software-defined networking. Increasingly, things are going to the cloud. I suspect, given the kinds of data you have, it's either a private cloud, maybe a hybrid cloud. If you find yourself in multiple clouds, the challenge is figuring out how to have consistent controls across those clouds. Build on what, the discussion we've already had about zero trust is critically important. Zero trust certainly in your internal data, zero trust in, you want as much to be customer facing, to be self-service as possible, but you again need to implement that consistent with zero trust as well. And Bob, this gets to the point you raised earlier. You are an agency that needs a full spectrum defense that's going to go from the kitty hacker up through the nation state adversary, but it also puts you in a role of the deterrent thing as well, having the cyber equivalent of saying this house protected by on your network. And I can tell you, put my former collector hat back on. If I think you've got things like deception technology and some of these other things there, am I not going to try to target you? No. Am I going to proceed differently to do it? Yes. Am I going to be slower at doing it? Yes. Anything you can do to take the advantage away from a would-be attacker is in your favor. So you need to start building things like that in systemically. Robotic process automation is here to stay, but I really get scared by intelligent automation when I look at an organization like SSA. So that's why I say sort of keep it scoped, start and stay small. I'd be really, really concerned about the kinds of associations the algorithm could make between, well, if I take this bit of data and that bit of data, and use it as a force multiplier, but be careful about the voyage of discovery.
Jim, I think we were out of time. First of all, I just want to thank you so much for this incredibly rich brew that you provided us today. There's just so much to digest and think about. And we want to wish you, of course, all the best, and thank you and Dave for taking your time to help us out. And I want to wish all of our participants and our viewers a safe and enjoyable weekend. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to follow up.
Great.
I don't lack for opinions and things to say.
It would, well,